Okay, Tori, in this conversation, let's talk about how thinking as an academic can set you up to fail if you're pursuing opportunities elsewhere.
Wild. Thinking as an academic might not always serve you. What? Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah, so what are we talking about here? Like identity, mindset, perception, right? Like all of these things, thoughts, stories, narratives, all of these things play into this. So, thinking of yourself as an academic, you start me off. You start this off.
Well, and it's funny when you say this thinking as an academic, I think there are two ways I see that it undercuts folks, and there are possibly more. One is that thinking as an academic might undercut you, right? It might tell you internal stories that don't allow you to go out and see your full realm of job opportunities you have available. So that's one way it can undercut you. Another is in the way you're perceived by others. If they have impressions of how academics think, and then you fall into those stereotypes, you might get discounted for opportunities that could have otherwise been a good fit. And so, really examining thinking as an academic, looking at it from a 10,000-foot view, allows you to understand how that thinking might negatively impact you or negatively impact how folks outside of academia see you.
Yeah, so right there, I think that is an excellent takeaway. So, like, hold that thought, everybody. Hold that thought. So, let's talk about in terms of thinking of yourself as an academic. One of the ways that this manifests, I think that is will be familiar to many people, is the idea that you have to convert your CV into a resume. Okay, let me connect these topics, right? So, convert your CV to resume. To me, the whole framing of that exercise is saying, here is a document that reflects what academia values and prioritizes. And all I need to do is some like conversion magic. And now I have a document that will demonstrate my value to employers outside of academia. And here I'm going to come in and say, whoa, if you're starting from a document that prioritizes privileges what academia cares about, what about all the stuff that academia doesn't value and prioritize? It might not be on your CV anywhere. So, right? Am I making sense that this is just an example of like privileging, thinking of yourself, to use our language, as an academic? And like, stop right then and there. Stop it.
Yeah. Well, and it's important also to call out that I think when folks approach that exercise, they think of it in terms of tactics. Tell me the tactics that I need to write a resume, to convert a CV to resume. But I think what we're calling out is that in addition to tactics, right? There's something that's just like, here's how to write a good resume bullet point. There are also mindsets involved, right? Stories you're telling about what's important, what's valuable, what you've done that matters, and those stories, those thoughts, those narratives, those mindsets are as important as the tactics. And so folks should not neglect them if they're thinking about moving to something new, because recognizing what are the things I value, what are the things that academia values, what might values look like outside of that system. It's really important to be curious and question that, because if you don't do that work, you can do all the tactics you want. It's going to be tough to have that conversation and dialogue around fit with anything outside of the academic world if you don't also do some of that re-mindset, re-narrative work.
Yeah. It's like, imagine this. I go out into the world looking for a job and I'm like, I'm Jen. I have a PhD in history. I am the one of the world's top expert in this very tiny little thing. I wrote this, hundreds of pages long dissertation. I occasionally ran group discussions and graded undergrad papers. I say that to anybody who's not a professor and they look at me like I have three heads. And then I very quickly think to myself, I have no skills, I have no work experience, I got no prospects, I'm not going anywhere, that's it. Right? So that's like another example of what we mean with thinking of yourself as an academic. The reframe here is, okay, how can I um separate my academic identity from who I am as a person in the world, right? That's like kind of step one. And then step two is, okay, how can I reframe how I think about myself in a way that is going to be meaningful, appealing, compelling to my ideal employers in whatever field that I've decided to target?
Yeah, it's interesting though, on that first point you call out, how do I separate my academic identity from who I am? I want to call out that at least for me, that took like a year of active grieving, right? Like a lot of tears, because I had basically so intertwined those two that to think that I would be something that wasn't that academic identity was very painful. And so, at least for me, that wasn't a light switch, right? That wasn't just I'm someone new now, right? Like that really separation of I am not this, right? And like I am not my work, I am not this academic, and that ability to keep yourself and your self-worth separate from your work is a hard process, but once you do, it allows that second step you talked about, which is being more intentional and curious. And so for anyone watching, really looking at yourself and saying, how much do I personally identify with my work? How much is my identity or my worth adjudicated every single day when I go into the office? And if you're able to separate out your worth from your work, you will just make your life a lot lighter. I'll say that from experience.
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk about ego, academic mindsets, and ego, Tori.
Talk about another lesson I learned the hard way. My goodness. I mean, after that first year of just identity grieving, then I had to like eat my ego for breakfast, right? It was really the amount that your ego will tell you you're really good at something. And then if you're not good at it, then you basically oscillate between that, like, I'm amazing, I'm terrible, I'm amazing, I'm terrible. And so I think the work for me in my first year in industry, once I had left academia, was to find this middle ground, which is I know things, I don't know everything. And so to have enough confidence that you do know some stuff, you have skills, you have expertise, you have competencies, and you're still learning. And paradoxically, both are true at the same time, right? It's not either or. It's not that you're a worldwide expert who knows everything and that, nothing is outside of your scope, nor that you know nothing and that you're useless and that you have no skills. Finding that middle ground allows so much more progress. Tough to sometimes do to let go of that ego and sort of not be oscillating between the two. But if you can find that balanced mindset, sets you up for success. I'm not sure if that's what you were teeing up, Jen, but that's what came to mind for me when I was thinking about ego. What about you? What have you seen or
Yeah,
experienced?
definitely. And it's really important because people leave academia, people seek work, right? However you want to frame this, people, look for jobs with a variety of different experiences, situations, contexts. And um, yeah, so folks might be pursuing non-academic work from a position kind of ego-wise to go with that of strength where they're published in top impact factor journals and they won awards and their book is published, whatever, right? So they may have a self-perception and a professional academic perception of them as like these big successes. And then they go out into the world where people perceive them in, variety of ways, and that's interesting. Or kind of let's do extremes here. There are folks who feel pushed out, kicked out, completely rejected. That is a self-perception, whatever. But and so, they never managed to get their latest publication past the publisher. Their book manuscript is languishing, going nowhere. They're only getting adjunct courses. They can't even get first round interviews. Like they might feel like complete rejects and very easy to slip into this sense of like I'm a nobody, I have no skills, right, blah 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 blah. So, yeah, what you're saying about this balanced mindset and coming back to, okay, but who are you? Irrespective of like, what else is swirling and how people are going to perceive you, that's going to be super important because you can't let academia both like blow smoke up your ass or the opposite, right?
Well, and it's funny as you were talking about that, and I know we had mentioned this earlier, the thing that was coming to mind for me is to say to folks watching this video, look at the stories you're telling yourself and ask yourself whether those stories are serving you. right? If you're telling yourself the story that you're amazing, is that serving you? If you're telling yourself the story that you're nothing, is that serving you? Whatever story you're telling about yourself, your work, your academic career, what academia is, what the industry job market is, those stories may have been ones that you heard from somewhere else or that you internalized at some point. And so really looking at them with curiosity and saying, huh, how does this bear out in terms of the evidence? Like, let me actually go do some data gathering to see whether this story holds up. But don't just buy a story at face value. Don't just assume it because your head tells you it's true. Examine all of those beliefs and stories with curiosity so that you can see whether they serve you and let go of them if they don't.
I totally had a moment of this years ago when I was finishing my PhD. I forget whether I was finished or finishing, whatever, right? But on the time. And so if anyone knows downtown Toronto and where the University of Toronto is, like it's very central in the city. And when you leave the gates, literally there are gates on College Street. You leave the gates of the university, you're on College Street and you walk east and almost immediately you hit University Avenue. But anyways, you want to keep going. You keep going on College Street and what happens? You end where the University of Toronto ends. It continues, but at least so let's say basically it ends. Across the street, you've got the Ontario legislature, the government. To the south and also continuing east, you've got the giant hospitals. Most of them are university affiliated hospitals, so healthcare. Now we've got university, we've got government, we've got healthcare. You go another block or two, you're at Bay Street. Bay Street is Canada's version of Wall Street, right? So now you're like really into think of things. You go south, you're in the financial district. You go north, you're in retail, right? Like everything is right there. Anyways, I'm going on and on. My point was I had this moment of thinking like, oh, I thought I would never be happy outside of academia and that I working in a university environment was like in this bubble, separate and removed from everything. And yes, there are physical gates. However, literally across the street in any direction, or heck, there's a subway stop right there. You can just get on it and go anywhere else and we are all working together. We are like physically all in the same place. And frankly, all of us, even in academia, are impacted by politics, by the economy, right? With capitalism, we are all in a pandemic, right? Like nobody could escape this stuff. So I needed to reframe this. I could never be happy outside of academia. It was like, well, I got how? What? This doesn't make any sense given like the literal physical proximity that we're all in together.
Well, and it's a really good point because I think academics like to tell this story that academia exists in isolation, that it exists in this ivory tower. And it's funny, as we're filming this in February 2024, university presidents have just been called to testify in front of Congress in the US. Like, universities exist in a system. When you are working for a university, you're working for an employer of a certain type that has certain considerations. If you're getting funding, if you're getting federal funding or private foundation funding, you are influenced by whatever the trends or considerations are in those funding bodies. If you're teaching things and you have certain considerations around what you can teach, politics influences that, what the university or your discipline is at influences that. And so not pretending that academics exists in this isolated world allows you much more consideration of, okay, what are the constraints on this environment? What type of environment do I operate in? How does it compare to other environments? And so there's a danger of only existing in that one environment without examining all the things happening around you, because then you don't necessarily recognize the considerations. You just take them as the way the world is. And academia, like any other job, right? It's not, I think sometimes we put it as akin to like a priesthood, right? Where it's like, okay, it's over in this like clergy type setting that's removed from the world. Just like those institutions are also influenced by what's going on in the world, so too are universities.
It is very freeing to realize that you don't have to box yourself into being a teacher, a researcher, an administrator, whatever kind of your CV titles are. That in fact, you can blow that shit up and you can call yourself whatever you want as long as you can demonstrate evidence of it. That is very freeing And that is the type of world that I want to live in and be designing with people, where we can be much more creative, intellectually open-minded. We can be learning and curious. We can make room for different Anyways, now I'm ranting, but it's like, join me in this new, freer world.
And the thing you said that I think resonates, that I think could be true for anybody, irrespective of background or stage or whatever, taking a curiosity mindset, curiosity about yourself, curiosity about the world. It just frees up so much. And I put that as an alternative to a judgment mindset saying, I already know how this works. I already know the way the world works. Nothing you can tell me, right? And of course, we've been saying things today that if someone came in with counteracting evidence, we could question our beliefs, we could change them. And so having that openness to change, that opportunity to change if you get new evidence or some new perspective, and the curiosity to be able to do that. It's actually amazing that these folks that we train in research, in being curious or skeptical, can sometimes get into these bubbles of not doing so. Not always, but sometimes. And so taking a look at yourself of, what am I taking as dogmatic that I need to question? Where could I bring more curiosity in my life? That curiosity mindset serves folks, I would say, in nearly any setting.
Yeah. And you talked about this already, Tori, but I think a great and a really, really important, not just great, but crucial exercise for folks to do are to identify those stories that you're telling about yourself, those narratives, those thoughts, those feelings, whatever, right? What are those stories? So I have no skills, for example. Okay, so you've identified a story. I have no skills. What evidence do you have for or against or neutral? What evidence do you have? And then what's the news story? Well, actually, I have a lot of skills, blah, 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 blah. In fact, there are areas where I would like to improve, and there are areas where I am highly skilled that I never want to ever do again, right? So another example are, I don't have a network. What's the evidence? Well, actually, it turns out that, right? So that is like a conclusion exercise that I would give to everybody is like, what is the story? What is the evidence? What's the news story?
Well, and it's funny, as you're saying that, I actually want to use that exercise for what we've been talking about, to acknowledge that a lot of my perceptions of academics come from my own experience and from a biased set of folks who come and find me. And so I'm certain that some of the trends I've been talking about today are not everyone's experience of academia. Not everyone would have these mindsets or these experiences, but I speak to them more to say there is a non-zero proportion of folks who experience this. And so if you're experiencing it, you're not alone. It's okay to have these questions. It's okay to do that. And so I want to question my own beliefs that, of course, like these sort of characterizations I've been giving of how academics works are not always the ones that everyone encounters. But I think that's the important nuance here, is to say there is nuance, there is variance. And so just because you're hearing some story about the way academics is or should be doesn't necessarily mean that tracks with your experience. And so it's so important to examine those stories, examine the evidence for them, and allow ourselves some curiosity about how those stories show up for us.
And I know that you and I typically talking to folks who are thinking about leaving academia or actively working, pursuing that goal. What we're talking about is so important for folks who want to stay within academia, because exactly as you're saying, there is a lot of variety in the academic world. And if you show up with your R1 PhD degree, thinking of yourself as a researcher first, and you want to get a job at a SLAC, a small liberal arts college, that yes, thinks research is important, but has an undergraduate population and values high quality teaching, that your self perception, your way of thinking of yourself as an academic is also not going to serve you. So, everything that we're talking about is the work that we recommend, if I can speak for the both of us, for anyone pursuing any opportunity within or beyond academia, how we understand that.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because as you're saying that, I would say that from folks who I have seen who have stayed in the same career and been very successful at it. So say those academics who have gotten the positions they wanted, or even in corporate, the folks who have climbed the ladder, it almost becomes tougher for them to question some of these things Because to do that would be to question their whole progression, the whole identity they've built, that this is important and I've advanced, etc. And so sometimes for those folks, if they're really, progressing and have had success, sometimes takes some sort of like life shock to have them question this, right? Or something else happens in their life that causes them to question their belief system that says, wait a minute, should I value the things I value? But I would say otherwise, it's very difficult to convince them to question the system. But for anyone who is in that transition, who is in that phase of questioning, know that you're not alone and know that it's okay to do so. But yeah, I don't know that we could go out and convince those folks who are firmly rooted. I think they are just going to have to wait for that moment they question themselves, because those folks are really like reinforcing their belief system. Where I think for many of us who have been forced with the sort of having to confront whether your worldview sticks in light of the information you're getting. If you've evolved your worldview once, you can evolve it again. But if you've been your whole life with one worldview, it sometimes gets even tougher to reevaluate it.
Retirement is coming. Retirement is coming for those folks. That'll mess them up good.
Ooh, talk about going from one system to like, who am I? Am I valuable without work? What do I do? And oh gosh, if that's the first time you've had to look at that belief system, that's hard. That's hard for folks too.
So, what is our concluding thought here? That thinking of yourself as an academic may not be uh, the right way for you to move forward, and it may be a pack of lies.
So like mindsets matter, stories matter. Don't neglect those as part of the process in finding a fulfilling career. And know that the stories you've been hearing within academia don't always apply outside of academia. And so have the openness to question those stories, right? Things that might seem like truths in your head may not be as true when you start gathering a more holistic body of evidence.
Absolutely. Let's leave it at that. Thanks, Tori.